Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this chilly November lunchtime. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise. And I'm actually much more excited about this subject than you may believe or than you may be. I can't think of a more exciting subject. And I'll very briefly explain why. I feel that I have lived alongside EVs for close on 30 years in a sort of tantalizing, flirtatious way. I was lucky enough to live in LA for a long time when GM brought out the EV1, and I test drove that and thought that was the future. Then went to Tesla's headquarters in the Bay Area as they were putting the finishing touches to the design of the Model S, which then took the automotive world by storm, amongst petrol heads as well as EV addicts. And then once posted to Washington, I had a test drive in a Roadster, a Tesla Roadster, on a downhill ramp leading onto the George Washington Parkway on the west side of the Potomac, which, if you know that part of the world, well, it was carefully chosen. It was empty, and it was unbelievably exciting. And since then, one or two of us at Tortoise have been nabbed by Octopus electric vehicles and offered a chance to test drive a Tesla Model 3 around Regent's Park, which again is surprisingly empty often at lunchtime. And the acceleration is just out of this world. But I still don't have one. So I'm part of the problem, because our question today is what will accelerate the UK's EV transition, and I can say straightforwardly that a little more affordability might help on my account. But as my wife might say, this is not just about you, darling. It's not about me. I hope over the course of the next 55 minutes, we'll talk about some of the granular technical stuff, range, charging, choice, and do some myth busting if there is myth busting to be done. Many of these things perhaps a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, were offered as obstacles to uptake, maybe less so now. Certainly some of those in the industry think so. But this is also about behavior, about social psychology, about changing behavior and expectations on a mass scale. And that in turn is also, I submit, about government and different ways of doing government and deployment of nudges versus laws, and policy generally, infrastructure, etc. So there's a lot to cover. I hope that by the end, though, I will have been able to underline in my notes some fairly specific things that we can add into the to-do list that we are compiling with the help of partners like BP, who we're doing this with today, as a sort of post-COP manifesto for saving the planet, to put it modestly. We're going to be joined later on by Dr. Ganga Shreedhar from the LSE, but we are already joined by Martin Curring from Economist Impact and Mark Earls. And just before I come to you guys, the housekeeping, many of you will know the drill, but I do want to encourage you to pile in. Tessa already has, thank you, Tessa, who's an enthusiastic driver of all kinds of cars. And you obviously have your own list already of what you want done. But pile into the chat, raise your digital hands sooner rather than later, so that we avoid the sort of 10 to 2 crush of everyone suddenly realizing they have something to say and we're running out of time in which to say it. But first, Martin, Senior Manager for Sustainability, Climate Change and Natural Resources at Economist Impact, which is part of the Economist Group. You've done a big piece of work on this recently on, if I have this right, basically barriers to uptake of EVs in this country specifically. What did you find in general terms? Are they letting you unmute yourself, Martin?
They allowed me to unmute myself. They have given me speech back, so I'm very pleased about that. And thanks a lot, Giles, and thanks a lot for the organizers for giving us this opportunity to talk about our research. And as you mentioned, when you have a kind of emotional connection with EVs, and there's also the kind of scientific and evidence that we wanted to add to the conversation. So Economist Impact, as you mentioned, is part of the Economist group, and BP commissioned us to look at what the barriers are in terms of uptake of EVs. So we did a study that looked at the UK in particular, 40 regions and the nations of the UK, but also comparing the UK with other leading markets around the world, looking at Norway, Netherlands, Sweden, China as well, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. So having the kind of the regional dimension as well as the kind of the comparison with other countries. And we did this because there isn't anything like this around. It's really important to see where we are, and the initial slides showed that there is a lot of excitement, but also there is a need to really look at this because the UK is banning the kind of new sales of petrol and diesel cars from 2030, and it's such a huge issue. And already in the chat, people are talking about COP Transport Day, and I mean, I was at COP, and there's a lots of literally kind of hot air around in terms of announcements, but what can we really do? So this research is really about what are the practical steps and what are the barriers and what are the practical steps that need to be taken to kind of, to accelerate the uptake of EVs in the UK. It's a big global issue. 130 countries have announced net zero emission targets by 2050. Transport sector is crucial for that. I mean, it already accounts for around 16% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And EV sales have actually budged the trend. I mean, last year during the pandemic, unsurprisingly, there was a 16% decline in global car sales. But for EVs, the trend was the other way around. I mean, the acceleration continued. So there was a 40% increase in EV sales. So clearly there's momentum, but now how do we accelerate that momentum? So we looked at these countries and regions and assessed them on 23 indicators across 8 pillars. And some of these pillars you have already mentioned, Giles, in terms of what matters to you on a personal level in terms of affordability. So affordability is one of our pillars. So looking at, is the switch to EVs affordable for the average consumer based on the price of buying, but also the price of operating over a 3 or longer period. Then looking at purchase incentives. I mean, what do governments and authorities do in terms of providing financial and non-financial incentives for the switch? Then looking at consumer sentiment, and the initial slides already showed that some studies show that only 24% of UK consumers feel confident in buying an EV, whereas 56% in the Netherlands. So there is clearly a gap between the UK and other countries. So consumer sentiment crucial. Then charging infrastructure. You mentioned some concerns there already, and it's not just about whether there are insufficient amounts of charging points or the number, but it's also, are they in the right places? Do they offer the right speed? And then energy infrastructure. We can't really do this EV switch if we also, if we don't think about the energy transition more broadly. I mean, is the energy sector sufficiently prepared for the transition to EVs? Regulations, are the regulations in place to support consumers and manufacturers? And then uptake in terms of, do these policies and incentives actually lead to EV buyers increasing the uptake? And then availability, are the policies and incentives in place to provide the supply in the markets? And we found that the UK has made huge progress in terms of providing incentives, but also providing infrastructure. But there are still these gaps in terms of a smaller share of consumers being willing to make the shift. The short-term cost of switching to EVs is a big concern, with the cost of running an EV 1.3 times higher in the UK than compared with conventional cars. So the cost issue.
To interrupt, that is even factoring in the fact that you don't pay 70 quid when you fill up.
Yes, that's it. So it's about a 3-year period, and that is mainly because of the depreciation cost. I mean, we don't really have a second-hand market yet, and the depreciation for EVs is just much higher. In Norway, which is the leading country in the index, the cost of buying and running an EV over a 3-year period is equal already at this time, 2021. Even though their target is 2025. I mean, they need to be a bit faster than the UK because they have a stricter target, but still they already are on parity in terms of cost. So that's a big issue, the cost in the UK, and then the available speed doesn't really match the need of consumers, particularly when it comes to highways and service stations. So in terms of fast, ultra fast charging, And then we also have the energy system still being, in this transition phase, and there needs to be more of an uptake of renewable energy. And then finally, the disparity within the UK, that's another key finding, is huge, with London leading the way. Actually, London would be, I think, 4th or 5th in the index overall, if it was just London, but the UK is 7 out of 9. But Scotland is also doing well. So we have done this regional analysis, but the disparity is huge. So those are the kind of the key findings of the study.
That's it. I mean, it's really interesting, granular research. And by the way, just to show that even though we do slow news at Tortoise, we keep up. A Telegraph is reporting, I think yesterday or today, you mentioned that only 24% of UK car buyers would feel confident buying an EV for all those reasons you mentioned just now. That is apparently now up to about 34. It exceeds, well, in terms of those who plan to make their next purchase an EV, exceeds the number who plan to make their next purchase a petrol car for the first time. And it's only according to one survey, and obviously the number depends on how you ask the question. But there does seem to be progress there. But I know the remit of your research was to focus on EVs and uptake, but I don't think we can pass by Charlie Hicks's comment in the chat without addressing it. He says he's concerned about whether this is the right question. And as you referred to, Transport Day at COP, making barely any mention of walking and cycling and stuff. What is, if you take a step back, what is the main reason that you have come away from your research with for granting EV uptake this priority?
Well, one of the key reasons is that it is 1/3 less greenhouse gas intensive. So the reality is that transport still is, in many ways, personal transport still very much reliable on car use. And if you have electric vehicles, the greenhouse gas emissions are only 1/3 of, if you take everything into account. And even if renewable energy was not used, there would still be a 20% reduction in emissions. So there's clearly a benefit here in terms of personal transport. But I see the point made in the chat, which is about what about cycling and walking and all these things, and that also plays a crucial role. And the COP Transport Day really focused on, in a way on cars and buses and these kind of things. But there is, of course, this other dimension as well, which is about how do we kind of go from A to B. So there doesn't have to be always with the car. But in terms of personal cars and personal transport, cars will still dominate, and that's why electric vehicles are such a step forward in terms of their carbon footprint.
Right, understood. Before we go to Mark, Charlie, did you want to come in on that? Because we held a ThinkIn on a similar theme at COP, at which Rachel Revers, a freelance journalist who has written for us, made a very popular intervention along these lines, to which, and I put it to you, one response was, yes, in an urban setting, absolutely prioritize these things that you're talking about. But what about people who are, frankly, because of their family situation or where they live, dependent on cars of one sort or another?
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm a county councillor in Oxfordshire, the most rural county in the country, so it's very much a question that I'm thinking about on a day-to-day level. And the latest that I've got to on this is that what matters is planning, to plan in a very dense way so that people can get to where they need to in all their services within the sort of 10-15 minutes walking or cycling. Mm-hmm. And all the carbon accounting that we're looking at says that making the shifts from internal combustion engine to battery powered cars is good, but it's nowhere near enough. And especially in this conversation about behavior, we should really be thinking about what are all the factors that prevent us from shifting our mode, and also about thinking about the distance that we need to travel, and that these parts of the conversation need to come in much more into these spaces if we're really to have any chance at all of getting emissions out of transport.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and good luck with that, because I mean, I can see how you can do enlightened planning for a place like Oxford, but Oxfordshire, getting everyone within a 15-minute walk or bike ride of where they need to be is an altogether different challenge, I would imagine. Mark Earls, let me come to you. Billed as award-winning communications and behaviour change expert, but more pertinently right now, author of Heard, How to Change Mass Behaviour to Harness Our True Nature. Mark, I won't betray the confidence that you shared with me before we started about what you drive, because let's call that irrelevant. But what if our true nature is not to make this kind of a switch to EVs en masse in service of the common good? What if our true nature is to keep a fairly clear-eyed judgment about our own personal needs and interests?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. One of the things that troubles all of us when we try to do behavior change programs is the horrible, hard truth that people do things for all kinds of reasons, do the thing they do normally because it's the thing they did yesterday and the day before that. So habit in particular and that kind of thing, which of course gets reinforced by infrastructure and other things, is something that holds us back from change. And it's one of the focus points very often of a behavior change program. How do you get people out of a habit? One of the dangers we all have in designing behavior change programs, alongside that, is that we try to make people agree with us. So whether you're working in social justice, or whether you're working in the green area, or whether you're working in healthcare, trying to make people understand and make the right decision for the right reasons is a temptation. It's a sort of an activist mindset, which I understand and I share on many issues, right? The rivers are something that really matter to me right now. And so hats off to Fergal Sharkey for all it's been doing about terrible stuff being pumped into our rivers day in, day out. So people do stuff for all kinds of reasons, and they don't want to think about it. One of the ways of summarizing all of the behavioral economics stuff that Daniel Kahneman and Dan Ariely and so on have done is this simple line that humans are to thinking as cats are to swimming. Now, we can do swimming, we can do thinking if we really have to, and cats can do swimming if they really have to, but mostly we'll avoid it. So we have to not make people think. Lots of really good evidence from, for example, smoking cessation studies, that the more you get people to think about giving up smoking, the less likely they are to do it.
Fascinating.
Counterintuitive, right? Counterintuitive, but
yeah.
The point is that, you know, this thing that lives in our heads, 3 pounds or something, can account for, at times, normally it's between 15 and 20% of the energy consumption in our body. When we're thinking really hard, it's 50%, and it's adapted. The structure it is adapted and evolved in order to stop us having to do that kind of stuff, which is where the sort of Daniel Kahneman's biases and heuristics and so comes from. For us, wanting to change behavior, thinking about individual people, we have to just make it easy. Not make them think, but make it easy. And that's the start. Don't try and make them agree with us. Make it something that's almost on their agenda for other reasons. And I often, with the consulting clients I have in behavior change, you know, we often come down to this basic question: is it really important for you that people do the thing you want them to do because of the reasons that you have, or that they do it? Because these are two very different objectives. And, you know, people do, you know, I do things for reasons which make sense to me after the fact. And my behavior gets changed for reasons that I don't believe. I don't understand why I'm doing them. So we have to just accept that I think that we want people to change their behavior in ways that they may not necessarily be on the grounds that we share and that we are advocating. So, for example, make it easy for people to make the transition. Don't make a fuss about it. Don't make a fuss about it. Don't harangue them. Make it easy for them to do it. There are a whole lot of infrastructure stuff that can help that, like, you know, really signaling the number of charge points that there are. Mm-hmm. Making a lot of that, you know, where a local council like mine in North London has put charging points into lampposts. Don't just have a little notice on them. Make that really visible. That's something that can be done at a local level by local councillors. The other thing is to make it, and this is what the Heard book is all about, which is essentially that We like things to be easy. We like decisions to be easy. We don't like to think about it. And one of the best shorthands we've got, apart from what I did yesterday, is what other people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
What other people are doing, and help people see other people doing the thing. Highlight it so it makes it so lots of these people doing this kind of stuff. Lots of people I know. This is used in the world of commerce all the time. That's what stickers and bags, and the Selfridges bag is just about that. So other people have got yellow Selfridges. That's what that's about. And the third thing to think about, given that it's unlikely to be straightforward, is to learn the lessons from things like the island of Samsø in Denmark, which was the first independently energy independent island in Denmark, and it's a case study for lots of things about behavior change. You have to keep at it and slowly build up the support for this. Help it, make it easy for people to keep going back to them, give them another option. Don't make them think about it too much. There's a marvelous man called Jürgen, I think it's Trundberg, who was a local farmer who took over that job of advocating there. If you think about what we've done with road safety education in the UK over the last 20 years, 30 years, it's not just one thing. We keep going back to it because not just there are new people coming into the driver population every year, but also people haven't completely convinced. My father's in his 80s, one of those generation, he does actually wear a seatbelt, but not all of them do still. Some of them drink and drive. And again, that's not something that I feel at all comfortable with, but we have to keep going back to those people. Mm-hmm. If you want to get adoption, you use all of those three things. 1, make it easy. 2, help people see other people. And 3, keep coming back to it. Keep going. There's another message that will be out this next spring about an anti-smoking message from the Department of Health, and that's okay. It'll be different from some of the ones been before, but we need to keep doing these things because you don't fix it like that.
Right. Well, evidently, and I wanted to ask you about the herd, actually, because the stats that we've seen and other stats that we haven't actually seen today, they all indicate that on EVs specifically, you've got very fast uptake from a very low base.
Yep.
So that the absolute numbers are still small. You go out onto in certain parts of London, like outside Tortoise HQ,
yep.
more than half the cars are actually electric now, but anywhere else in the country, yep, they're not. They're just not. And this is a two-parter. Is there a likelihood that we'll get to a point where all the early adopters and the enthusiasts are there, and that might account for perhaps a quarter of the car buying public,
yep,
or a third, but then the other 2/3, 3/4 prove a really hard nut to crack? Mm-hmm. And if so, which of those 3 things, make it easy, point out that other people are doing it, keep at it, does one of them become the most important?
Well, I think one of the things that, so just as a sort of high level framing of this, one of the things we want to think about when we're trying to get a whole population to move is think about it not as making them move, but how do you spread the behavior through the population? So it's a diffusion question, not a persuasion question.
Okay.
So having said that, it's both easy and in fact, it's all 3, but you can use it in an established base of people, so long as they're not understood by the non-adopters, the laggards, if you like, the mass of the population, as weirdos. I mean, that's my point about not making this a really big deal. Help people see other people who are normal doing this thing. Use that established base, make it more visible somehow, but without making it weirdos. And the last thing we want to do is have people beating each other up about it, whether it's in a pub, online, or whatever, because that kind of confrontation, it naturally creates some polarization and a lot of resistance. Even if the arguments are right, even if the facts are on the table, everyone agrees with the facts. We have to help people do the thing that we want them to do using other people's behavior.
Okay, thank you. I've got one more question for you. In a second, I'd love to come to Elizabeth if you wanted to explain why everything seems to be going in the wrong direction of your part of London. But Mark, just one more question on your sort of hierarchy of approach. Well, it's not a hierarchy, it's a list. I get accused at Tortoise of droning on about Tesla and Elon Musk as if I wanted nothing more than to be in a bromance with him, which is sometimes true, though I accept that he's weird in certain respects. But has he done something beyond making it easy and making it usual to have an EV? Has he turned what used to be dismissed by petrol heads as a milk float into just an object of obsessional desire? I mean, has he crossed the line into a whole new area of behavioral psychology?
I think that's right. I think it's the difference between, I don't know if you remember, before the iPad was launched, there were things called tablets. And tablets was no one quite knew what they were for. And certainly the industry didn't know what it was for. And there were all kinds of speculations. And I actually worked with the Sony consumer electronics people on the launch of their version. And what was quite clear was that Apple had a different understanding and made it a thing that was outside the particular category. So a Tesla isn't even an EV, right? A Tesla is a Tesla is a Tesla. Mm-hmm. It's different, and there's got lots of social status in it because of the price point and because of Elon Musk. So it's a different kind of thing. And the more of those kind of things we have, the better, because they take it away from this decision that seems very weighty about EV. You know, one of the really tricky bits is for us to imagine what it's going to be like in 3 years' time, when we've got much greater penetration of electric vehicles. Will the Tesla be the dominant one or not? How will people feel? Certainly, I suspect they'll feel as different about EV technology and users as we felt 3 years ago, before Tesla actually happened. It was just a bit of noise, wasn't it? It was a bit of tech bro throwing money around, showing off. But they have created a group of people who are really excited about this. We may think, may not like those people, we may have stereotyped them in a certain way, but that's a start point. And that's the lesson that Apple teaches us about how you take a technology and make it widely acceptable and widely enjoyed. And just as Apple do. So Apple make most of their announcements nowadays in front of the development community who depend for their business on Apple. They don't make it direct to the world. It is via these people who are very enthusiastic. And that's like building a community around what you're going to do. So that community will itself then evangelize your stuff. I think that's what Tesla have done thus far. And I think we need more of that stuff. There will be other electric vehicles are available. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm just going to throw in, just because it goes to me, is a way of making things easier is to embrace the shift we're having from vehicle ownership models, which are about ownership, to access models. So Zipcar is one, but the premium brands like Land Rover, Jaguar Land Rover are already offering, pay this amount a month and that's your vehicle. Then you want to change it whenever time you want, just change it. Change it at the weekend, change it now, change it next week, keep it for months, doesn't matter. So that kind of subscription model of ownership, I think, is a very different thing from either leasing or ownership. And that will allow people to make the move easily without thinking about what the technology is underneath.
How much does that cost, by the way?
A fortune, and it's beyond my budget, I must say. But it's your brand new Range Rover kind of budget.
Right, I bet. Martin, I see that you've got your electronic hand up. I also see that Dr. Ganga Shreedhar has joined us. That's great, and I want to come to you in a second, both of you. But having invited Elizabeth to say her piece about what's going wrong in North London, if you'd like to, please do.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Giles. Good afternoon, actually. I was just going to say, actually, I live in the Enfield borough, and I moved here 3 years ago from Haringey. And we had cycle lanes put in and no one was really using them, actually, which was really frustrating. But what then happened is that with the COVID money that came through, they installed all the low traffic neighbourhood, which has cut off something like 14 or 15 roads that you would cut through across a park, round where there was never any traffic anyway, to now everything is literally routed all around from green lanes from Finsbury Park down to Winchmore Hill. And it's a nightmare. I mean, there's literally traffic at all times. I wrote many letters last August to councillors, you name it, MPs, Mayor of London, and I had a few responses, but in each of my letters, I really made the point that we have no electric vehicle charging points in the borough. And I think there's now one or two, but there seemed to be no infrastructure put in place to think about how to change that. and also the cycle lanes are now right along where all the traffic is, so people are using them less. And it just seems to be we're going in the wrong direction rather than the right direction.
Fair point. And I should say there's a mirror image, or the same thing, sorry, happening in my part of South London. And I'm sure that the law of unintended consequences is working out there. I'm less sure that the planning people behind it will be flexible enough to see the error of their ways. But thank you. We've got 2 electronic hands up, but let me please first come to Dr. Ganga Shreedhar. Thank you for joining us. You're an associate professor at, maybe assistant, forgive me, of behavioural science at LSE. And thank you so much for joining us. And
thanks for the promotion as well as the invite.
You've done a lot of work on sort of trying to change people's minds in other parts of the world, particularly the Gulf, and trying to encourage people to reconcile personal interests and broader interests. I mean, are there any lessons that you can translate directly into the question that we're addressing today, namely what will accelerate the UK's EV transition?
Yeah, I guess the first thing as a behavioral scientist, I guess I would say, is to make it easy.
Right.
And that essentially means putting the infrastructure in place. And I think that might have already been covered. So maybe also speaking to a point that was raised in the chat, I think another way of making things easy is actually just having good public transport. So things like good trains, things like actual low carbon modes of transport, which are easy to share. Those are the things which would really matter, which will also ease up the sorts of investments you might have to do to put EV infrastructure in place. I have also invited a student of mine, Charlie Hicks, who works extensively on this, who's in the chat. And he's always talking about a modal transport, and I totally agree with him, which is it's not about getting more individual bits of consumption on board, but it's figuring out how we get people to change the way they move. So that might be through things like active travel. It might be about rejuvenating neighborhoods, and actually putting those sorts of infrastructures in place would be really important to change habits as well. More broadly, if we're thinking about changing habits, it's a question of not just having the infrastructure and context in place, but also the incentives. I've seen some research which suggests that actually nudges there might not work very well, but actually if you do things like subsidize public transport, that really works. And the reason I am talking about public transport in an EV conversation is because there is a material cost to EVs, as was noted in the chat, right? There's 2 types of costs. One is actually sourcing the materials from supply chains, which are increasingly global, and the inherent instability which comes with that. And the second thing is a question of where you displace pollution and what the source of charging and electricity for those EVs are. I've seen some studies which show that even if you have good infrastructure in place, you might just displace the pollution to a rural neighborhood if it's not a decarbonized sort of form of energy. And if you really want to get people to reduce their consumption in that case, which is important in cultures where there's overconsumption, such as the UK, it should be about actually making other forms which are low carbon, cheaper, easier, more available, and better networked. So that will include things like investing in rail systems, investing in better bus links, investing in like things like even trams. It's old fashioned to say something like trams, but there might be a space for that in some parts of the country. And actually having that infrastructure in place would be really important.
Thank you. You mentioned the idea that more investment in better public transport and low carbon modes of transport might, and did I understand you right, might free up, in addition, money for the kind of investment that is necessary for the new infrastructure to support more EVs. Are there studies showing that that might happen?
No, but I hope there should be. Right. I think that would be really interesting to explore. So if you think about EVs, I would say for short trips, we shouldn't be using electric vehicles. We should be using active forms of transport, especially if it's within cities. But if we're thinking of long distance travel, that's why infrastructure investments in things like rail will become really important.
Right. And I see. So are you arguing, if you'll forgive the cliche, for a joined up approach that uses savings from one place to invest in the infrastructure necessary, as you say, for more train capacity for longer routes, but some people are still going to have to drive longer routes as well, and that's where you need fast charging capacity down the motorways.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think this joined up approach is incredibly important, because a lack of it means that we focus too much attention on something which serves one purpose, but then cuts all the savings effects in the others. If you think about what climate change is, it's an interconnected problem. So you mentioned the Gulf, for instance. Emissions from here will impact people there. Emissions from there impact people here. It's the same way that emissions from something like an EV network will impact what your actual carbon budget is and what that's available, to people either individually or even as countries, right? So I think you need this joined up approach, and that essentially means talking about substitutes to EV and making them cheaper, and that has to be through things like public transport.
Okay, thank you. Let's come back to Martin, and then Bruce. I see you, Bruce Davis, you have your hand up. We'll come to you after that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Giles, and the contributions from Mark and Ganga were very insightful as well. And just wanted to react to Mark's contribution. I think that it's really great, and also a great way of kind of looking at this in terms of the ease, the signposting, the consistency. And actually, just wanted to use the example of Norway, which is the leader in our index, that they have done exactly that. So the Norwegian approach is an example of these three elements. I mean, they began the reform already in the 1990s, actually in the year 1990, when they first introduced incentives for EV owners. So they made it easy by, they lowered their road tax, they lowered charges for toll roads, they allowed free parking in some municipal car parks. So that really showing that ease, but also the signposting. If you have free parking, it's everywhere, you can see it. So that really helped with kind of nudging consumers to shift to EVs. And then they consistently pursued that path. They lowered sales tax for 25% recently. So they're continuing on that path, and that consistency and persistence that Mark also talked about. So that really, we can see that in our research, that actually pays off for countries like Norway. And I just wanted to react also to the points made around the materials. And in the chat, we can see that as well. There's this concern around, all these, cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel, all these things that we need for electric vehicles. And all that is true. And it's also true that mobility as a service and sharing and public transport are all great. But if we then actually look at electric vehicles, and if we take everything into account, all of that, all the petrol use and all of the use of mining and processing of these materials, it is still produces only half the emissions than a conventional vehicle. So those people that want the convenience of a personal car, with all these things taken into account, all of the cobalt, lithium, and all these things, it still produces only half the emissions of conventional cars. And if then the battery is also recharged from renewable sources, then that footprint is halved again. So clearly, when we talk about cars, even if you take the mining and all these things into account, EVs are really the way to go.
Thank you very much. Bruce.
Hi, yeah, so it's just two things, I guess. Firstly, I suppose we were working with Greater Manchester, a company called Aduna, raising money for them to develop EV infrastructure there, where there's a big disconnect. People talk about London, but in the Northwest in particular, there's not enough charging points. So they very much see there's a problem there, that if people can't see the charging points, then they don't even consider electric vehicles as an option. But they're very much a data-driven company, so they're coming back for hopefully for a second set of chargers to get crowdfunded and raised through our platform. But what they've sort of reported back is they can kind of see the behaviour on the ground and what's actually happening in Manchester, where you've kind of got this evolving adoption. And there was a big surge over the summer as really people were looking at other drivers here. So if you like, the negative drivers, which is particularly around energy costs, by fossil fuel costs themselves, and that's sort of stimulated people to then think about this as a consumer purchase.
Right.
But the thing we felt was really important for Aduna and others in the sort of EV world to really take account of is that they are part of the transport strategy for that area. And then you do need to work with local councils, that they should not be cut out of the conversation. They're part of the conversation, and that's around planning and zoning and taking the data that EV guys have together with the public transport data and coming up with a coherent strategy, which arguably, Oxford takes the lead on that in terms of the way it's trying to take cars out of the centre of its city. Manchester's a long way, is moving towards that. But I think, part of that for us is then you need political buy-in, and by political I mean citizens, people, that is the way forward, because I think that's where the LTNs in particular were implemented in a rather clumsy way. It was done to people rather than consulted with. And so I think, the argument we would put is you need more democracy, not less at this point. And that's where we see things like municipal investments being a really important platform for then communicating not only why what you're doing, so that people actually see there's action on the ground, but why you're doing it. And people start to see that slightly bigger picture. So I think one way to change behavior is to change people's horizon. And that's something you do in retailers. You get them to look up from their normal behavior and go into a different aisle. Well, we kind of need them to look up from their normal behavior and try a different transport option. So for us, it's sort of saying EVs is a good way into people's transport decision making, but it shouldn't be the end game. The end game should be that someone then considers the fact that they might cycle or walk instead of certain journeys, because they're getting this more convenient EV experience elsewhere. And I think then the final driver is what we're seeing is that people who own land, and that includes local councils, are seeing this as a major revenue opportunity. So I think, and that's now changing the nature of the type of charges that people want to implement. So we're seeing bigger numbers of charges in single places and stuff like that. And I think that will also drive take up, because you always know when you arrive there, you're going to be able to charge your car. So it's sort of these things taken together holistically. I completely agree that there's a consumer behavior change challenge, but some of that is about changing the communications mechanisms that you have. And for local councils, they don't have lots of expertise in that just yet, but they're building them up. And that's something we're trying to educate them with, is saying, well, if you launch a green bond or you do things around that, then you have a platform to talk to citizens about the change that's coming in their town and the fact that they actually have a say in it, as opposed to simply being nudged into a different behavior, because I think then sometimes that can backfire a little bit.
Bruce, you mentioned Oxford, and Charlie Hicks is obviously there or thereabouts. Is that the best example of a local council doing smart stuff? And if I lived there as somebody on the cusp of beginning to think about trying to acquire, sell a kidney and lease an electric car, would someone have reached out to me and said, our records indicate that you fall into this category. We advise you to get a Renault Zoe, but park it out of town and use a bicycle most of the time. What's the optimum behavior for a local authority in that context?
Well, I guess so. My experience of Oxford is that they've taken cars out of the centre by removing the car park that was in the middle of it. So that was a big disincentive, and they built it in terms of, that comes back to zoning. So they said, if you want to have a good time, you've got to get on the park and ride, because there's nowhere to park in the middle. So I suppose they just removed choice. Right. And as someone that used to live near Oxford when I was younger, I can attest that there's less traffic there now. But I think it's interesting to compare that to Cambridge, where you'd think everyone would love cycling and alternative routes, where actually the local car drivers there are quite aggressively defending their right to drive wherever they want. And that's what I was saying about it. This is also a political narrative. That people feel that if they're feeling that their choices are being taken away from them or constrained, they react in irrational ways. And they might, if you had a conversation with them about net zero, fully agree with the idea of achieving net zero, but then still want to drive their car wherever they like. And I think we need a way to sort of have that conversation that doesn't become polarized into red and blue, for example. So we've seen better implementation in cities that are not in the red wall, for example. It's harder to implement these things because there's a rather toxic political narrative going on that says it's about freedom or Marxism.
Right. Yes. We'll try and steer clear of that. Look, we've got the 3 electronic hands up. Ganga, is that it's a different color hand? I've not seen that before. But was there something that you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about behaviors, I just wanted to emphasize a lot of travel behaviors are habitual, which essentially means people do this automatically. So it's not a deliberate, conscious choice. Amongst those travel behaviors, you'll have a couple of behaviors like buying a Tesla if you can afford it, which are deliberate, right? Mm-hmm. Which is where the choice to buy something comes in. And then it's a question of who's making that choice. So what range of consumers are you looking at? And the second thing in that context is when are they likely to make that choice? So when we're talking about things like a Tesla, we're typically talking about those who have the ability to afford that, or in a service range, for instance, if you're running a car company or an Uber driver or something like that, where you can make those sorts of choices if you can afford to, right? So the question then is, how do you disincentivize making the wrong purchase or make it easier through something like a subsidy? But another thing, which is about when to buy it, would be, for instance, when people shift homes or there's a big shift in their jobs, things induced through things like COVID, that is an ample time to actually make the intervention, which will get people to change their habits. So if the goal is to actually incentivize more sustainable behaviors, actually looking at moments of disruption actually helps. So there's a lot of literature on the habit discontinuity hypothesis, for instance, which looks at when should you get people to adopt new habits. When they change home, when they start university, when they move from working in office to working from home, you know, those sorts of changes are those disruptors that you actually need. Now, if you have a set of strategies, whether they're nudges or actually removing options like changing the car park, putting those in moments of disruption are actually very good to have sustainable behavior change. So I think just wanted to put that out there, because often the conversation is how best to do it apart from when to do it. And those are moments of change where you should really be trying to target.
And does that come at all from your research in the Gulf, or is that just a general finding?
It's research on habit formation, right. And it's habit discontinuity, essentially.
And I did want to ask slightly separately, from what you can tell, has COVID changed the way people respond to nudges? If I understand it right, you've written that pre-COVID, there was it was generally true that citizens responded better to nudges than to edicts, sort of legislation type thing. But COVID has forced government to act in a more draconian, decisive way. Has that altered, or do you think it will alter people's preference for nudges versus laws?
It's a good question. So we did a review in the literature, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, especially in Western and European contexts, there's a lot of support for softer interventions around things like nudges, because they actually don't curtail freedom or impose costs, right? For something like climate change, actually, you might want big investments in infrastructure. You might want to penalize fossil fuel modes of transport, things like that. So those might not be the only, nudges might not be the most effective or the only way to do it. In some cases, defaults can be really effective. We talked about putting a car park, removing a car park. That's in effect changing what the default is, right?
But the question is, will people accept that?
Now we find that actually in the context of COVID, there was greater support for more interventionist policies, probably because people perceive they're more effective. Now, this is very nascent research, and a lot more needs to be done, because it could also be the case that because of things like lockdown, there's a lower tolerance for being in lockdown, especially when other interventions like vaccines are more available. So people can see a way out and are less willing to actually be subject to such draconian measures. But it really depends on the issue domain, right? We find that there is emerging evidence that shows that people are not less worried about something like climate change, at least in the UK. So I think the jury's out in the context of, is there greater appetite for more draconian measures? But what I would say is there is definitely a stable amount of concern, if not rising concern, for things like climate change and sustainability, which might make people more open to taking up new habits and changing the way they used to live their lives as more information becomes available and the issue becomes more urgent. So we've all seen various scientific reports saying 5 years left to prevent this sort of scenario, etc. Right? So especially in the wake of COVID, because of things like habit discontinuity, as I was saying, it might be that people might have the appetite to adopt new technologies, new behaviors. But whether that is the case will depend on what policies and processes are put in place to convince people to do that. Right. And that's where I think we're a bit lacking, because there's very conflicting signals. So on the one hand, you find like subsidies for air travel. On the other hand, you find EVs being rolled out. On the other hand, you have the HS2 being shut down, but then people still arguing for things like rail. So I think in a way, if you're talking about the politics, a consistent messaging about what the strategy is to address that issue and how citizens can take those actions will be really important.
Yeah, I hear you, but I also hear another voice in my head saying, consistent messaging in this country at this time on anything complex, and I'm not making a political point. I think it's more about us as a bunch of people. It's for the birds. But anyway, Tessa, and then we'll come back to Charlie, and then I do want to make sure that all our invited guests have another chance to speak. Tess.
Hi. The only point I was going to make is that even if you are minded and in a position to afford an EV or electric option, the barriers, the infrastructure is so poor in London. I have one. I could not rely on it as a form of transport because the access to charging is so limited. 2 out of 3 chargers in my street aren't currently working, despite months of reporting it. You have a really complicated system of payment, which requires opening different accounts to different people. You don't have a simple one-touch, one-pay system. And we've either got to have a massive leapfrog of infrastructure investment, which is going to get us to the right place, or people will still default to something that is convenient and safe and reliable. And if you look at most people sort of driving, it is, you know, a lot of it is family-based, a lot of it is transporting kids and so on and so forth. And as I said in the chat earlier, I defy anybody to get around London with a babe in arms and a toddler in a buggy with no flipping lifts in most of the tubes. And as I said, you know, I once saw my buggy fly around Holland Park roundabout out the back of a route master. It is a nightmare navigating London on public transport with small children. And until we make that a lot easier, until we have fully enclosed bike lanes, until we have huge charging infrastructure, people are going to take the easy option. And
I hope there were no babies in the buggy.
No, thank God I was holding the baby.
Right,
I'd actually taken it out the buggy.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And in fact, before we stop, I want to put those points to Martin. But first, Charlie, have you taken your hand down? Charlie might have had to go.
Hello, sorry, just resetting my Wi-Fi.
You were waiting patiently.
Thank you. Yeah, just wanted to respond to some of the comments. I wish Oxford was that far forward, but I think Cambridge still outdoes us in terms of cycling rates. I just wanted to say I've looked into the literature about what changes private car use, and unfortunately, it's only really the stick that works. So reducing car parking capacity, increasing car parking charges, reducing road capacity, like reallocating road space, for example, low traffic neighborhoods, or altogether, or road pricing, which is going to become more part of the conversation as we move to EVs. All of these things are going to annoy people because it is a curb on freedoms. And so the question does, I think, need to come about how do you bring people along with you and the political conversation in terms of that behavior. And I would really take it back to, we need to start thinking about the avoid, shift, improve strategy. So EVs are part of the improve part. This is something that came out of the German government from the 1990s. Avoid is very much how do you plan your spaces in a way that reduces the need to travel, and then shift, that middle one about shifting the mode of transport. And I think as part of this conversation, as we're seeing, that the EVs needs to be part of this broader mix, whether it's ownership models, whether it's the type of transport that we use, whether it's thinking about where and how and why we travel and maybe traveling less. All these things need to come part of the same conversation, I think.
Thank you so much. Right, 3 minutes left, and I want to give those 3 minutes to our 3 speakers. Martin, first of all, I want to just pick up one specific point from earlier in the chat and then invite you to address Tessa's points. Is it the case that the way ahead in terms of, this is fairly granular, of where you place charging infrastructure, we need more in fewer places or more in more places? What's the optimum charging map look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when we actually look at the granular data, and I invite anyone to kind of download the full data set. It's all freely available. And I think the website was shared, impact.economist.com/sustainability. And you can actually look at, the charging point density. And it's interesting because, one of the speakers was talking about Enfield and so on. And we look at the different, places, even in London, there's a huge divergence. I mean, inner London, west, inner London, the charging infrastructure is just so much better than anywhere else in the country and in London. I mean, there are 56 charging hubs per 100 kilometers of road
Tess
network.
is in London and she's completely appalled by it.
Yes, but yeah, I mean, it depends on where you are. If you're, this is the average for West London. East London is still like 15 charging hubs per 100 kilometers, and then the more we go to outer London, the less it becomes. Outer west and northwest is 10, and south is 5, and still that is not bad compared with the overall average in the UK is just 1.6 charging hubs per 100 kilometers. So it really depends on where you are, but also depends on the signposting, because one of the key points made was it might be available, but you don't know where it is. So the signposting is absolutely crucial. But it's not so much about more is better. It's really about providing the right speed for the right need. And that's really what we have found, that 50% of drivers in the UK prefer to kind of charge in service stations, highways, but less than 5% of charge points make this possible for people. So it's really the right speed for the right need rather than more is better.
Okay, thank you so much. Mark, what about, where does, P. Chandran, I'm afraid I don't know your first name, is just saying, what about the pride of owning a luxury vehicle? I want, and he's actually referring to non-EVs, but what about the role of excitement in all this? And in a sense, I'm referring back to Tesla. We're being slightly wonkish, aren't we? And it's a wonkish subject in a sense, but is it eventually excitement, if harnessed properly, that will change behavior on this in a big way? Fashion?
Yeah, I think it's, as I was saying, I think it's about making it easy to make a transition. And some of that is going to be, this is not actually a change. It's just my new car. I'm not making a big technological change. And so in other words, locating it outside of the right thing to do argument. I think that's a really big thing that will play a part. I just wanted to pick up on what Charlie said, because I think he's right in talking about it's a bigger conversation. It's going to last a long period of time. I just keep coming back to, whenever I think about this trying to address this kind of problem, of Gunter Grass's novel From the Diary of a Snail. He was working with Billy Brandt and so on back in the early 70s in Germany. And he says, we all get frustrated when we want to make change. We imagine it's a straight line. We never quite get where we want to go, and we're all arguing about the detail. Change is more like, in large populations, substantial change is more like the track of a snail. It sort of goes one way and then veers another way and then veers another way. But it goes eventually in the right direction. And that's what we have to find a way, a resource of for ourselves as people who are concerned about this issue and want to make change, to accept the wibbly wobbliness of the direction of change, or the direction of travel.
Thank you so much. Ganga, you can have the final word. Looking 5 years ahead, what hope do you have of the kind of joined up approach that we agreed was necessary, optimizing simultaneously climate-friendly public transport use and walking and cycling and EVs in the right way?
I think the only chance we have is if we throw everything that we have at it to do all these things. That will include things like having nudges. It will include things like making it cheaper to travel in public transport over long distances, changing your infrastructure. I think now is, rather than thinking about what's more effective, I think we actually need to make everything work for us. And that will include things like making it trendy and sexy to have an EV. It will include things like, making it high status to take public transport. It will include just making this the norm. It has to just be sustainable as the norm, and it has to just be normal to do that. So it shouldn't be something extra that we do. It should just be a matter of course, which does necessarily involve like a cross-sectoral approach. And I think now is actually a good opportunity. So not to be too pessimistic, but this is a good opportunity to do that because we are at a rupture. Like now the economy is opening up. So if we had to act, there is actually no better time, because that's what the evidence suggests would work in terms of changing habits.
That rupture being COVID.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you all so much. It's been really insightful. This was a subject on which I thought I knew a little bit, but heaven knows I didn't know about the habit discontinuity hypothesis. But thank you, Ganga. Thank you, Mark and Martin. Mark, I will take away the phrase, "This is not actually a change, it's just my new car," and also your reference to the diary of a snail. I feel that I probably haven't given enough prominence to the themes voiced in the chat. And I think there was a lot of support there for the notion that we always have to consider this switch from petrol to EVs in the broader context of the need for sustainable transport generally. But I think this was nonetheless a conversation worth having, because we're not going to uninvent the car. We do have to clean it up. And I think it'll be fascinating to see as we look ahead how the way we use them changes as they change. I won't rabbit on. It's 3 minutes past 2. Thank you, Martin, Mark, Ganga, and everybody else. Charlie, great to have, by pure chance, not just an Oxford counsellor, but also a student of one of our speakers in the room. Thanks everyone else for taking part, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.